It's good. People wonder what a constitutional convention is, and if I had to make one fundamental point, I would make this point. It's part of the governing process. It's built in. It's not an unusual, it's not extraordinary. It's built in so that you get a chance as citizens to say whether you're satisfied or not with your government. If you're satisfied, you say, no, I don't need to review this in a serious way. And if you're not satisfied, then you say, yes, I need to review it. So this, where were we here? So this slide is just one example that I picked out about our Constitution. Our Constitution is functionally different. Our state Constitution is functionally different than our federal Constitution, as I presume you've heard. So, and it has a lot of stuff in it that we don't usually think of as being in a Constitution. One aspect of our state Constitution that's interesting is that it's about 50,000 words long. And 1/3 of those words, roughly, are about the judiciary. So there's great detail about our judiciary, which is regarded as the least well-organized judiciary in the United States by many scholars. And the reason this is, I think the reason that we have this level of detail in our Constitution is so that judiciary can protect itself from the legislature. It puts its operations and structure beyond the reach of the legislature by putting it in the Constitution. So so this gives you a brief timeline about the growth of the judicial article. Now, I happened to be appointed to a commission by the Chief Judge to consider the Constitution and possible agenda for the courts for constitutional change. And I was in that room with a friend of mine named Peter Gerry, who I think is the principal scholar on the state Constitution history in the country, in the state. And Peter said to the Chief Judge, I can cut the judicial article by 1/3 without changing it in any substantive way. And there were a lot of lawyers in the room who were skeptical because they know that changing language changes meaning, and language is important. And he went back to his office in Buffalo and did it. 1/3, reforming it, which many of us want to do. And I'm not supposed to be an advocate in this meeting. I'm supposed to be neutral according to the sponsors, so I won't go into that detail. Now, I'm not certain that he didn't change it at all. But there's so much excess in it, so much dead letter law, so much obfuscation, so much repetition, that in my view, when law doesn't mean things to people, when it means something opposite, like, for example, our gambling provision, which says there's no gambling in New York, which we all know is not so, has lots of amendments. When law doesn't mean what it says, people lose respect for law. It's just common sense that they would do that. So one reason people want reform, some people want reform, is because of the excessive detail, complexity, and damaging obfuscation that you find in the Constitution. Now, so I picked this one example and to make that point. This is the second example that I picked, and that is an article that was written and included in the 1967 Constitution that people in New York State did not accept from the convention. People in New York rejected the 67 Constitution. A lot of people who are critical of the process say, well, this proves that the process doesn't work and it's wasteful. And I just wanted ordinary citizens to see the redistricting provision that we put in our draft Constitution. 3 simple paragraphs that would have given us neutral redistricting and changed the direction of New York State government from that date. Because we would have fair and competitive elections, or one element toward fair and competitive elections. The other, of course, I think, is the way we finance those elections, a separate subject. In other words, we can have had provisions that have seriously changed the way we do things in New York. Now, that convention was, that Constitution was rejected, and we could talk about the politics of that in the Q&A. But it's not true that that was a bad Constitution. What's true is that it was rejected because some parts of it were very controversial, and the people who put it forward brought one question forward rather than a number of questions, and giving people options on some of the more controversial areas. So we can and have done a good job at revising our Constitution when given a chance. A couple of other points, and I'm going to give this up because I know we have to hear from other people. We've had 9 conventions, as I'm sure Evan pointed out from the slide on that. In the 19th century, every 20 years we had a convention. In the 20th century, we had conventions 3 times, in 1915, 1938, and 1967. In the last 50 years, we had no convention, and we've had several chances. And you know, what comes to my mind is what happened in New York so that people lost confidence in the notion that they could make things better. It seemed to be routine in New York that we would review the fundamentals of our political system, what a techie would call our operating system, the underlying fundamental structural dimensions of our system, and we could fix it. You know, and they did, and they were New Yorkers. And then we started, for some reason, and I can speculate about the reason, but we decided that changing our system, we weren't somehow sufficiently knowledgeable or engaged, or it wasn't sufficiently important to us to change our system when things went wrong. And it's palpable that things have been going wrong in New York, and I'm sure Evan has or will make that case. So I think that we need this not only for the particulars. We need this because we need to seize control of New York and put our mark on New York and redirect New York. So that's not a neutral statement, but I'll stop with that. The cost, and there's my name and address. If you want to know what I really think, you can contact me at this.
So, Gerry, we're supposed to be neutral with an overview in history, so I'm going to ask Evan.
I'll get out of the way.
Remark a little short so that we can be fair to both sides. Thank you.
Of course, the questions from you all are the most important part of this discussion. That's why we're really here to answer questions. So I just wanted to pick some of the topics, not an exhaustive list by all, but just some examples. So one is and conflict of interest in Albany. I was there for 5 years as counsel to Governor Mario Cuomo. I know Albany pretty well. Everyone tells me that it's gotten worse since I left. And if you look at the newspaper, you see that it's gotten worse with 30 people in scam. They come from all political parties. They come from all branches of the government, to top aides, to Governor Andrew Cuomo have just been indicted in a kickback scheme. And then conflict of interest, and people sometimes think that conflict of interest is a really boring, Boy Scoutish kind of topic. But you have to remember what the conflict is. It's conflict between the public interest and the interest of some big contributor to the candidate. So it is, when you have that conflict of interest, the risk is that the money will be spent not on what the public needs, not on what the state needs, but to meet the needs of the big contributor or other, politically connected person to whom the lawmaker has become beholden. And we have up in Albany this problem with people having quite often large outside businesses. And so you have clients, whether they're insurance clients or real estate clients or quite often law clients, and you're beholden to your clients because they are paying the bills and you want them to pay the bills, and that creates a conflict that you might do for them rather than do for the public. So conflict is not a trivial problem, and I believe that billions are wasted each year in Albany. The money is just pissed away on the needs, not of the people, but on the needs of these people to whom lawmakers have become beholden. And we can change that. We can tell legislators they should not have outside businesses. It's plenty of work to do there, to serve constituents and have it as a full-time job. And we can create an enforcement mechanism that really works. Right now, the mechanism in Albany, I'm sad to report, is a joke. There's a 14-member ethics commission. But believe it or not, 2 of the 14 members can veto an investigation. 2 out of 14. So if the person who appointed those 2 isn't happy to be maybe investigated himself or have his or her top people, and in New York, remember, it's 3 men in a room, so it's always, currently at least, his top people, then it's not going to happen. And that means it's toothless. It has no effect, and that contributes to wasting all that money. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about gerrymandering. Gerry mentioned it because he showed the legislature wrote a gerrymandering amendment that goes on for 4,608 words. I counted the words on word processing. And the other amendment, which is a simple way to do it with an independent commission, 268 words. And what the legislature did, it's all smoke and mirrors. And it actually enshrines the political parties being in charge of drawing the districts. That's not what you want, because they can't help themselves. They're going to draw them for political reasons. They're going to draw them to create districts where you can't hold your lawmakers accountable because the seats have been made totally safe. And they're going to draw districts which, if there is a contest, it's going to be at the primary level. And at the primary level, the activists on both sides, this, because the primaries, you're appealing to the extremes. Whereas if we keep the focus on general elections with better districts that aren't gerrymandered, we'll have more consensus and compromise and come together better as a state. So that's second. Third, I thought I would mention home rule, because one of the big issues is the legislature loves to tell local governments what to do and then give them no help in paying for it. These are called unfunded mandates. And New York legislature, compared with all the legislatures in the country, is particularly good at this. And one example that comes up again and again is most states do not make local government pay for Medicaid. New York State makes local government pay a lot for Medicaid. So I looked at the budget of Orange County this morning, and if I read it correctly, it's about a $760 million budget, the county budget, because that's where Medicaid is. 10% of that is for Medicaid. That's even higher, that's way higher than New York City. That's way higher than the suburbs. And it is because communities that are impacted are also asked to pay, which compounds the whole problem. So a constitutional convention could change that, and how do I know that it could change that? Because in '67, they changed that very thing. They provided that the state would pay the cost of public assistance and Medicaid and all that kind of thing. And that would be a state charge, so that communities that were trying to recover wouldn't be stuck in a trap. So I'm only going to make one other point about why we should have a convention, and that is that in these conventions that Gerry talked about, all these conventions, we're just going to take the conventions from 1894, when the Constitution we have today was written, that's quite a while ago, to the present. There have been 697 delegates at those 4 conventions, 1894, 1915, 1938, 1967. 697 delegates. Guess how many of those delegates have been women? 17. 17. So there was 1 in 1894, 0 in 1915, 6 in 1938, and 10 in 1967. So that's 2.4%. So women, and an equal point could be made with regard to people of color, who are also totally absent. But women are 51% of the population and have never really had a role in crafting the supreme law of the state of New York, which is our Constitution. And one of the reasons I think there should be a Constitution, it's about time to have everyone in the room really making the decisions, and not just a bunch of, well, you fill in the blank for the bunch of. But anyway, those are a few reasons, and I'm going to stop there so there's time for others.
So Chris has joined us, Chris Ludlow from the CSCA. You're based in Beacon, on the other side of the county, out of Beacon. Okay, and Chris is government affairs. I don't have my paper in front of me. Okay, good. Come on up, Chris.
This thing on? Hey. Should have written something down, I feel like. I feel a little underprepared. I'm just kidding around. I do want to thank you all for joining us tonight. You know, my favorite show on television, This Is Us, comes back tonight, and you're skipping watching that, so I appreciate that. Have your DVRs set. So I do work for CSEA Union. I do want to get that out of the way. I am a labor union employee, and I do think that in the Q&A that might come up, a few things about pensions perhaps, so let's just get ahead of that. I look at a constitutional convention and why we wouldn't want to hold one in New York State as kind of a three-legged stool, right? I feel it's unpredictable, it's unaffordable, and it's unnecessary. So why is it unpredictable? We've heard a lot of good things that could happen. Theoretically, things could happen at a convention. But we don't know what would possibly happen at a convention because we don't know who the delegates are that would go to the convention. Until we know who's actually going to be elected to go represent people at this convention, we have no idea what will come out of a convention. So it's a complete question mark. As was pointed out, the delegates are elected from state Senate districts, plus 15 at large, for a total of 204 people. It was also pointed out that there's no rules about current elected officials not being able to run to be a delegate. So if in 2017 voters of New York vote to hold a convention, what I think we very well might see is in 2018, the current special interests, the current elected officials that are currently in Albany, who are going to be appearing on the ballot in 2018, running for re-election to their Senate seat, Assembly seat, you know, whatever it might be, I feel those would be the ones most likely running to be a delegate. And if you feel it's going to be a people's convention, put your name up against a state senator or an assemblyman and tell me how the vote goes. I mean, they have name recognition, they have infrastructure, so chances are high they're going to be the ones elected to go to this constitutional convention. We call it a boondoggle for special interests. You know, and that's what we feel it is a boondoggle for the already powerful Albany people. We feel that it's unaffordable. They pointed out the numbers. 204 delegates are going to be paid $79,500 a year. That's pretty good work if you can get it, I think. So $79,500 a year. They're able to hire staff. They are able to rent out, you know, office space, things like that. So there's varying numbers as to how much this might cost. We had it, I think the top line here was about 70 million. We have it a bit over 100, between 100 and, you know, it's not sure what it would cost, but it's very expensive, you know, and it's not necessary. I think the pension credit is huge there too. So you get a pension credit if you serve as a delegate. So if you're an elected official or you're currently serving in a public office, if you're in the pension fund, you're going to get 2 years of pension credit for essentially doing your job twice, right? I'm already an assembly member. I'm going to go over and I'm going to go to my job as a delegate. And I'm going to get 2 years of pension credit for my 1 year. That doesn't seem right to me. And it's unnecessary. I don't think we need one in New York State. We currently have a process to amend the state constitution. We just legalized casino gambling, right? It's a messy process. It takes a long time to amend the Constitution, but it should. There should be time for informed individuals and organizations to come forward and present their arguments as to why it's a good idea or a bad idea. The Constitution is too important of a document to just open up and say, well, you know, we had one vote of 204 people, 103 people said it's a good idea, it's going before the voters of New York. And on top of that, just like in 1967 when they grouped it all together under one question, there's no guarantee that in 2017 or 2018, 2019, when this finally comes for a vote, that it won't be one question again. That's not guaranteed. That's theoretical. So who's to say that there's not going to be one really popular idea that a lot of New Yorkers are in love with? You package it with some, potentially really devastating ideas, and you do it as one question. And you have that popular idea as the balloon, and you hope it gets it over the hump. There's a lot of question marks. And with these delegates, we don't know who they're going to be backed by. Coming out of a labor union, this is something I'm concerned about. The state constitution, it is what defines our ability to collectively bargain, to organize, to be a union. There's a group called the Koch brothers. I'm sure you guys have heard of them. They funded Scott Walker's campaigns back in Wisconsin in 2011 when they really devastated labor unions out there. New York State has the highest union density in America. We're about 22 to 23%. I don't believe that if given the opportunity, that the Koch brothers would not get involved in the election of delegates to attempt to cripple labor unions and public employees in New York State. I believe you would see a large influx of money coming in for these elections to these seats. It would be such a feather in their cap to cut unions in New York State out of the knees. And this is a prime opportunity for them to do so. I do want to get to the Q&A, so I'm going to cut that short there, but bring it on. Hello. Oh, just try talking into it.
Hello? Yes, definitely. Who will be delegates? So in the last convention, 186 delegates. I told you there were only 10 women. There were also 13 members of the legislature out of 186. Why is that? Why didn't more of them run? Because they do run in 2018 for their Senate or Assembly seat, as was pointed out. The reason is it's sort of political suicide to run for two offices at the same time, both of which have a salary, both of which may have a pension. The legislature has to vote the pension, but your opponent, you're handing your opponent a very big issue. I don't think anything has changed. I don't think you're going to see legislators running for delegate. I have gone around talking to zillions of people, and there is an energy to run for delegate that did not exist 20 years ago. The people who are marching, the people who are resisting, the people who are fighting for union rights against what's going on in Albany, they want to bring about change. And they're going to run. The Koch brothers are going to have their hands. So we have to remember that New York is not Wisconsin. When we think of Wisconsin, you tend to think first of La Follette, who was a wonderful liberal leader. But Joe McCarthy was from Wisconsin. Joe McCarthy was their senator. Wisconsin is this very ambivalent state. New York, highest union concentration, deep blue state. 40 of the 63 Senate districts went for Hillary. New York is a very strong, progressive, union, women's rights, all these good things states, and we can make it stronger.
Could I just jump in there, though? You said 40 of 63 Senate districts went for Hillary, and that's true, but let's look outside of New York City. How many Senate districts went for Hillary?
Well, I think there are, how many New York Senate districts are there in New York City? 20?
I'm saying Donald Trump, without a doubt, carried upstate New York by a very large margin.
Not in terms of Senate districts. If you look at the map and you take, Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, Binghamton, Plattsburgh was carried by Clinton. It's New York State. If you count by geography, the places where there are no people, Hamilton County has 5,000 people in the whole county, and I'm sure Trump carried Hamilton County.
Gentlemen, let's get on with it.
His total vote was 32%.
Okay, good.
All right, thank you very much.
Welcome to you all. Good evening, Professor Benjamin.
Am I kind of sentenced to silence the entire bench?
Not at all. You can raise your hand and I will recognize you anytime. All right.
If I'm supposed to be neutral, and this is a debate, I don't know
Well,
what I'm saying.
please.
I would prefer not a 2-on-1 here, a gang up.
Before we begin, let me recognize County Court Judge the Honorable Robert Freehill, who's in the audience with us here. If we need an official judge, we've got one here. So welcome to you all. I'm going to do these in order that I've received them, but the ones I can read are going to do first. First one is, if I fail to turn over the ballot and mark yes or no, will my vote be counted as a yes? If I don't vote, in other words, if I don't turn over the ballot and don't vote, my vote will be counted as a yes. Your vote will be counted as a no. I would think you're not voting. Is that correct, gentlemen?
You can.
But not be counted. Right? You don't get.
Is this rumor that's just totally, we all agree, it's totally untrue. So, your vote, if you don't vote, your vote is just not counted. The result is determined by the majority of the people who vote on the question. That's why it's so important to vote on the question, so that your vote will be counted.
Okay. Next question is, what are the two questions that will be on the ballot with the yes or no to the convention? Mr. Davis, do you have?
So, since I was counsel to Governor Mary Cuomo, I have to know all these things about the details of the law of what's going to be on what and so on. So I don't want to monopolize, but the first question will be the Constitutional Convention question. The second question is a proposal by the legislature to allow pension forfeiture. In other words, people who have been convicted of felonies to, in certain circumstances, lose their pension. That's question 2. Question 3 is, and it's supported by all the groups up in the Adirondacks, to create a 250-acre land bank for the Adirondacks. So there'll be 250 acres that can be used for health and safety kind of things, like when you have to put in a telephone line, you don't have to amend the Constitution to put in the telephone line. There's a land bank of land available, and that is broadly supported. And all of those things, in my opinion, should be voted on favorably.
The next question is, how will the delegates be paid? I assume in Bitcoin by that time.
You know, if it's one, I don't know how they're paid. Is it?
So the Constitution says their pay is what legislatures get for 1 year. And so it's $79,500. With regard to pensions, actually the legislature has to pass a bill to give pension credit for a Constitutional Convention delegate. They did that before. Now, the legislature is so opposed to the convention now, I don't know for sure that they would, but in terms of the salary, it's what I just said.
This is a three-part question. First is, how long will it last, and is there a hard stop? Who pays, and is there an agenda? Mr. Ludlow?
Yeah. So there's no time limit in terms of how long it's going to be. You see the slide, it said between 4 and 5 months, but that's kind of the common practice. I don't believe there's an actual time limit as to when the Constitutional Convention would have to end. You asked for who pays the delegates? Taxpayers. So we would pay the delegates. And the agenda is set, I believe in 1967, majority leaders were elected and whatnot. So it becomes a unicameral legislature to where they set their own agenda and they have their own staffs and things like that.
They adopt, the convention adopts its own rules and selects its own leaders. The agenda, the substance it takes up, is dependent on what matters are brought to it by the delegates. The delegates introduce matters for consideration of the convention. These are referred to committees in the convention in a conventional manner and considered, recommended from the committees, and proceed through a process that's established by the convention, adopted by the convention.
The next question is, if approved, and I assume that is a new constitution, how will it affect people on pensions? Mr. Ludlow, that's...
So I'm going to answer this because it's an interesting story. Just before the 1938 convention, and it was the 1938 convention that added the pension protection. So even before there was any protection in the Constitution, the New York Court of Appeals, our highest court, had a case. And it was a case where people were trying to reduce the pension of a retiree. And the Court of Appeals, this is before we had the provision of the Constitution, said you can't do that because it's a contract. And once it's a contract, it's protected by both the state and federal constitution. And so there they were speaking, because we didn't yet have the state provision, they were speaking of the federal provision. It was a contract, you couldn't reduce the retirees. But they weren't clear enough about current employees, people who had not yet retired. What was their status? And so the convention in 1938 decided to extend the same contract rule to all current employees, from the date of membership right through their contract. And because it's a contract, under the federal constitution, under the state constitution, it can't be impaired or reduced. And once you make it a contract, it's a contract. If you look at Birnbaum versus the UFT, this is the principle laid out clearly by our highest court. So the convention has no power to take away the pensions of any current employee. It could improve pension protection, because right now, there's no pension protection for people who have not yet become employed. That's why we are up to Tier 6. Tier 1, Tier 2, those of you who are in state or local service know about these tiers, because they make new tiers for new employees. We could actually put in the Constitution that says even new employees, that the state has to have a basic pension forever, for everybody. That's not there now. That is a protection that could be added. But in terms of current employees and retirees, their pensions cannot be taken away.
Mr. Ludlow, would you like to add something to that?
I would. Thank you. So you mentioned in 1937 that they, through the convention process, added these protections. The convention process can do quite a bit. In terms of the federal protections for public employee pensioners, we can point to examples in Rhode Island, Illinois, Detroit, where we've had people currently currently working that have had their pensions reduced. So, I think that but there's a few more things. We have fear that they might open up tiers and switch people to different tiers, make everyone a tier 6. There's also a possibility, this is straight from Comptroller Tom DiNapoli, that something he's heard is that they simply end the defined benefit structure, a pension, and go to a defined contribution plan, which would be a 401k. So if that's coming from Comptroller DiNapoli, that means it's being discussed at pretty high levels. Not that he does not support that, by the way, but going from a pension to a 401k is something that could be done as well. Now, that wouldn't affect past pensioners, current pensioners, but that could certainly affect the structure and the stability of the pension fund moving forward.
So just very quickly on that, for future employees, people who are not now working for government and who are not retirees, right now it is true the legislature could go from defined benefit, which is what we have, to defined contribution, 401k as you put it. That could happen now. At a convention, you could do something to make that impossible, because it's not impossible now. Rhode Island didn't have this contract provision the way we have in New York. They made it a contract, so it's protected by both the state and federal constitutions. Rhode Island didn't have that. And Illinois and Detroit, unfortunately, when you're in bankruptcy, which is what happened to Detroit, all bets are off. Whether it's the state constitution, federal constitution, they no longer protect you. So may we never get into bankruptcy. Fortunately, the state is very solvent now. The Constitutional Convention would not have a bankruptcy excuse to do anything to current or retired people, and it could not do so.
The next question is, historically, how much overlap has there been between legislators and delegates? Gerry, would you like to try that one?
Well, that was partially answered by Evan. We had 13 sitting state legislators in the last convention.
Okay.
We also, so there is some overlap. There are also former members, but as has been pointed out, the elections are simultaneous. I wanted to point one other thing out. Many of us who've been working on this for a long time have put bills and constitutional amendments in through friendly members to limit dual office holding, for example, to limit dual collection of pensions as a result of service, to change processes for electing delegates. The legislature has systematically failed to act because they don't want, in my judgment, they don't want these problems, what they regard as problems, to be overcome. They want them to remain barriers.
The next question is there any specific evidence that there's real movement to eliminate or reduce pensions? I think we've gone through that, but that's been...
It's a big question, right? Again, until we know who the delegates are at a convention, we don't know what would happen. So it's the uncertainty, it's the potential money coming in from outside forces. You know, to run to be a delegate, it's going to be expensive. You're running in a Senate district. So right now, a competitive Senate district can be upwards of $1 or $2 million. I've been involved in a few races where it's gotten up there. That money's going to have to come from somewhere. And if these are going to be everyday people running to be elected delegates, which I don't believe they will be, I think they'll be inside special interests, they're going to have to be backed with some form of money. So we don't know where that's going to come from.
In fact, the next question is, how are the delegates chosen, and who will they be?
So let me speak to that. One big change that makes it so much easier to run is technology, because you can reach people using modern Facebook, and look at our president reaching all of us every morning on Twitter. The cost of running a campaign is way down, and if 3 of you decided you wanted to run for delegate, because there are 3% a district, you could team up. You could join together in circulating your petition. You'd need to collect 1,000 signatures, but if you divide it up and you each collect 300, that's not so bad. And you could also join together in raising money, and you're going to have a lot of company. I have a feeling that if there is a convention I certainly hope to see a lot of union folks running for delegate. And I would welcome that. I would be with them. And we can, I'm going to run for delegate in, I used to live in Cornwall, but I don't live there anymore. Otherwise, I'd be running right here. But I now live in Manhattan where I work, and I'm going to run for, it's basically going to be up to you who the delegates are. That's the basic answer. You're going to decide. I think you're going to have a lot of choices, because there'll be all these energized people, and you'll get to pick.
Louis, could I
Sure.
say one thing?
Sure.
When you think about it, we're not supposed to be able to predict who will be delegates. We're supposed to have an election and choose delegates. One of our problems is that we can predict all too well who's going to get elected to the state legislature. We want it to be less predictable. We want there to be competition. To argue that we don't know who'll be elected it troubles me a little bit. I think the people who want to be elected need to mobilize their support and run for office. There are no incumbents in these offices. They're all one-time experiences. So actually, it's easier to run for these offices than to run for state legislative seats where there are entrenched incumbents in districts that have been fixed to assure their reelection.
There are no incumbents in these seats, that's true, but there are people that know what to do, right? There are people that have connections to receive money to run. There are people that understand campaign infrastructure. There are, again, insiders that will have a much easier time being elected, running a conventional campaign, as opposed to your everyday man or woman.
The next question is, what is there in the Constitution that couldn't be addressed through legislation?
So the problem, from my point of view, is that there are things that you can know for sure the legislature will never do. If you believe in term limits, just imagine that. You believe there should term limits, should be turnover, it'll reduce corruption, we'll have a change of people. You can take it to the bank that the never put forward limits. And if you think the legislature is about to put forward a constitution to limit their power, how local governments how to spend their money, I think you would be dreaming. It's not going to happen. And if you think that the legislature to end gerrymandering, which really is the way to protect incumbents and prevent this, never going to happen. They made a stab and they came up with this 4,000 years. It will not. The only
So wind up there. They're going to gerrymander districts.
you know, I would say that I would to say that we should elect them in assembly districts. That would be great for Democrats, but that wouldn't be right. People want. I think the Senate right now, equipoise. You know, in Democratic conference, and let me tell you, he has the most gerrymandered ever seen. It will represent cross-section. It won't be extremes like Jerry Benjamin, person, sensible. Senate districts for that. Okay, and it's not going to be carried the vast majority of those districts.
So, you know, Louis, minute, and Republicans have been gerrymandering Senate districts. I was an elected Republican for 12 years. The Senate districts were, they were pretty good at it, and they kept Republicans getting elected in the Senate. almost consistently over history, with very few exceptions. But there just aren't enough in New York to elect the Senate. So now the Senate districts are electing and able to organize. So, and it's quite a balanced situation. A lot of divided outcomes. Remember, you're electing 3, so you could elect 2 Republicans and a Democrat, or 2 Democrats and a Republican. More likely to get those. That's why the Democrats have the advantage in this situation. I'm not sure. Happens to be the fact that the bias system no longer the way it was designed, that it's a much more Democrat.
Question. I don't think it's controlled by Democrats or Republicans. I don't think that should be an issue if we can't control that. But let me ask the next question. In 1967, how many of the delegates, state senators, or assemblymen? Well, I should say.
Those are.
Answered that,
We did answer
13 out of 1.
There was, I believe, the Congress.
Jacob
Judges.
Jack a convention. Of our senators are going to be running for convention. They have plenty in 2018.
I'm not sure. Gerrymandering is maybe somebody can define that. People part of the seat, but you've already mentioned that, I think.
Right.
Gerry, you want to maybe elaborate on that?
It's named after somebody named Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts. I always resented that it's called. People think I did it. The various states have figured out remedies for this, and it's been the Supreme Court to see if there's an example. The Supreme Court has said you can't, and by constitutional, you have to have one person, one vote in legislation. One district full of some people and lots of people, and another district with almost no people, which we used to do in New York. By statute, we can't be biased against people on the basis of race. It's protected classes, race, and certain other characteristics, not all demographic characteristics. But partisan bias, extreme example of partisan bias that they would prohibit it. So it's not constitutionally barred under the national constitution. In some states, we have neutral processes. California is an example that is quite neutral in designing districts. So some states have achieved reform, but we have not. We took a stab at it in 2014, but got a system that has essentially left the matter in the hands of the legislature, which still does what I've written a book on this, and I call it a bipartisan gerrymander. The Republicans do the Senate, the Democrats do the Assembly, and the governor signs off because we say in Yiddish, he doesn't want the mishigas. He doesn't want the craziness of trying to oppose the legislature defining its own districts.
This is a question I'm not sure it pertains, but well, I'll read it. What is the legality of quasi-public corporations? I'm not sure.
So this is it's a too long a subject to discuss tonight, but I assume they're speaking of public authorities.
Yeah.
And public authorities are legal, and they've been created as a way to do an end run on the debt limits in the state constitution. And they are in many ways very wasteful because you have all these duplicative staffs. Looking at that issue could be a way that a convention could save a lot of money Another issue in this same category, very difficult politically, but a convention could look at, is the question of consolidation of local governments to prevent duplication. I tell the story that when I lived in Cornwall, I lived right on the line between the village of Cornwall and the town of Cornwall. And a kitchen fire, and both fire departments responded, and in front of my house, they ran into one another.
Okay, this is a statement, I think. I'll read it. How many are aware that the Libertarian Koch brothers are funding a federal constitutional convention? This effort is already successful in Republican-controlled legislatures. I'm not sure whether that's a statement, but so we're aware of that, are we not?
Well, this is really an interesting question. I am not in favor of a federal constitutional convention, and we are not talking about a federal constitutional convention. There have been over 200 state constitutional conventions. So it's a widespread practice, and state constitutions do different things than federal constitutions. I had a slide on the constitutional system. They work together, but have separate functions. There has been a movement to call for a federal constitutional convention by the state legislatures. That is true. But this is a different topic, and they're not linked. Supporting a state constitutional convention has no connection at all with the issue of whether there should or shouldn't be a federal constitution. I would not be here advocating a convention if in any way they were linked.
Gentlemen, we're almost at the closing time, so I think we'll have you each speak a minute or two if you want to sum up, and then I'll have Nancy send you all home. Mr. Davis, Mr. Ludlow, final words?
I don't know. I think we've really covered the topics.
Good.
I'm just going to say that the most important thing, and I said this before, is please vote on this question. And not only you vote, but please discuss your views with, your friends and neighbors. Tell everybody about, because a lot of people don't know about the Constitutional Convention. You are now in the top 1% of what people know about the Constitutional Convention. So please share your knowledge, whatever it is, whatever your opinion is, and urge your friends to vote, because it is a once-in-a-generation issue, and it's too important to just skip the question.
Yeah, I agree fully. I think this has been pretty informative. I hope that you found it so. Hopefully it helps you kind of figure out where you're going, what you're thinking come November 7th. But please do vote. It's important. It's going to be a low turnout year. 2017 is it's an off-year election. We have a county executive race, but that doesn't draw like a governor's race. So it's important to turn out on November 7th and exercise your right to vote. Make sure you turn the ballot over, and whatever you're going to do, just vote on Proposition 1.
It's hard for me to add to what I said since I don't know what I said. But I will say this: there are around 14,100,000 to 3,200,000 will vote on this question. Many people who come to vote don't vote on the questions. They vote on the candidates, and they forget that there are questions, or they don't vote at all. If you read there was a very famous lawyer named Marshall who wrote the amendment clause to the Constitution in 1894, at least famous for people who study this stuff. And I read the debates of 1894, which are actually very interesting. I know it's a certain obsession of certain people, but and he complained that people didn't vote on propositions. And he complained that the Constitution might fail, the 1894 Constitution, because people didn't vote on those questions. So it's been a problem for centuries. It's very important when you think about what a small 1.6 million New Yorkers are going to decide whether we have a convention or not. What a small number compared to the number of New Yorkers. It's very important that people go out and vote. And this notion that somehow if you don't vote, it will be counted against your view is salacious and false. And go and vote and help make the decision. I strongly urge it.
Well, thank you all for doing your civic duty this evening and coming out and listening to this very informative presentation by you gentlemen. Thank you, gentlemen, for doing it.
Just quickly, there were a couple of questions that we couldn't read. And so I'm sure that Gerry and Evan and Chris would be happy to stay behind and answer those two questions if it wasn't asked and you wanted it answered. And I want to thank you all three for doing this. Chris, you were stuck between these two two old guys. You did really well. So thank you very much and enjoy your night, everybody.